There's a great saying by Dolly Parton that if you want the rainbows, you have to put up with the rain. And I think there's just a bit too much rain at the moment. And I think we all have to work out how to find the rainbows.
Jo Tanner.
Jo Tanner.
Highly esteemed political strategist.
And former advisor to Boris Johnson.
We've got to acknowledge that the world has changed post-COVID. For a lot of people, things are really tough. It can be pretty bleak.
We try not to eat a lot in one day.
Not having a health service that works effectively, if you can't even get through to your GP, we've got some pretty big problems to solve. What we're seeing with the riots at the moment is that a lot of people feel left behind. They don't feel they've had a government that's been speaking for them or doing things that are relevant for them. We're letting certain issues dominate the debate, which also feeds into the narrative that's coming from the protesters, because if the biggest topic is always immigration, then you think immigration's to blame for everything. It's not. The health service is not going wrong because of immigration, because we wouldn't have anyone working in the bloody thing. Years ago, men used to doff their hats and the ladies would nod or whatever, but we often walk past people, we don't want to get eye contact with anyone, and it's like we've become so much more insular. And I think it's the same in politics. Reaching across the divide, having a conversation, saying hello is the start of forming the foundations of the solutions that we need in the future.
The streets of Britain have seen unrest before, but the riots that recently swept through the country reveal a new level of turmoil. What began as localised protests rapidly escalated into nationwide chaos, with scenes of looting, clashes with law enforcement and widespread destruction. It's a visceral reflection of deeper, systemic issues simmering beneath the surface of British society. Today, we delve into the heart of this unrest, exploring the underlying causes, the political landscape, and the societal fractures that have led us to this moment. To guide us through this complex landscape, we are joined by Jo Tanner, a renowned political strategist with over 25 years of experience in the field. Tanner, who has advised some of the most prominent figures in UK politics, including former Prime Minister Boris Johnson, brings a wealth of insight into the dynamics at play. Her career, which began in journalism before transitioning into political communications, has given her a unique perspective on the intersection of media, politics and public sentiment. In this episode, we will discuss the recent general election, which saw the Labour Party win with a sweeping majority, the implications of their victory, and the challenges they face as they navigate a turbulent political landscape. We'll also explore the deeper societal issues that have contributed to the riots, the role of the media, and the government's response to the unrest. Through this conversation, we aim to uncover the complexities of Britain's current crisis and consider what steps can be taken to heal a divided nation. Bearing in mind some of the challenges that we face today, it seemed the perfect time to get you on, so here we are.
Who knew where we'd end up when we first started talking about doing this?
Exactly. So before we dive into it, let's maybe start with who you are, what you do and why.
Okay, so I'm Jo Tanner. I'm usually called a political strategist, and most people will go, what's that? And sometimes I wonder what it is as well. But my job, my profession, I suppose, my career started 25 years ago as a budding journalist who then decided journalism wasn't for me. And I fell into political communications, where you help advise politicians on how to talk to the media. And from that, ended up working with a variety of different people, set up my own business, which I had for 17 years. And as part of that, advised Boris Johnson, who's probably the biggest name your folks will know of. He's the blonde bombshell that ended up being a prime minister for a while, not Liz Truss. He lasted a bit longer. And then I now advise companies for a company called APCO, who are a global consultancy advocacy firm. And they advise companies on a range of challenges. But I still get calls from politicians here and there asking for a bit of advice. Between that and some commentary on the elections and just talking about the news generally, that's what fills my time.
Amazing. So let's maybe start with the elections. Labour came in with a sweeping majority. What are your viewpoints in respect to why such a large majority? And I guess what are the opportunities and challenges for a new-ish Labour government?
So why a big majority? One party clearly lost the election in a big way. Their voters stayed at home, and people that actively didn't want the Conservatives to get back in went and voted for other people. They didn't all vote for Labour. The commentary's out there about how Labour's vote actually went and how shallow it was in some places. But they won based on the way that our system works and the way that the vote is distributed. They won a lot of seats. So they've got a big majority now in Parliament, which is a big deal. And it's something you can do great stuff with, but it's also something that can cause you a lot of problems. And we saw that really early on, that no sooner did these folks get in that they were being challenged over the 2-child benefit policy and decided to sack some people pretty much from the Labour Party took away the whip. So they can vote with the government, but they're not part of the bloc, as it were, when they are in Parliament. So that was a big move from Keir Starmer. And pretty much, I think they went in knowing that they had quite a lot on their plate. There was a lot of conversation during the election about tax rises and whether or not there was going to be any money to do all these impressive things that they wanted to do. Lots of debate about whether it was all smoke and mirrors from both sides. And sooner were they in, big speech made by Rachel Reeves, the new Chancellor, first female Chancellor, and she's saying, guess what? They've left us a right mess and there's no money. In fact, there's even less money than we thought we had. So we saw this kind of quite big debate happening straight off, which was how honest have they been and also how honest have the Tories been while in government. And then off the back of that, suddenly riots appearing and other countries offering guidance to visitors to the UK, which is something I never thought I'd see in my lifetime.
Yeah, that was like a few hours ago, right? UAE, Australia and Nigeria saying go to the UK with caution. We will get to the riots, but before we do, I'd love to get your take on Rachel Reeves' first major speech.
Yeah, it was a big moment. And I think it was something that probably had to be done because the big question had been constantly, what are you going to do? How are you going to get growth? How are you going to do all these things that you've pledged to do? So there was a degree of kind of, it feels a bit like going in and auditing the house you've just bought and working out whether you got done over in the sale or not. And particularly with a new house, when you tend to find snagging items, things that might still need addressing by the builder, there's an element of getting in and actually finding out. They termed it bringing out your dead, and had this sort of call to ministers to go and find out what money was going to be needed, what were problems in their departments. And they did it pretty quickly. So to be fair, it's probably still an ongoing piece of work, which we'll see more about in the budget at the end of October, but also probably the spending review that will come forward about what money individual departments can spend. So that process, I think, had to happen. I think it was pretty bold. She was very clear. She was clear about where the problems were. She was clear about where the gaps were, less clear on what's going to happen as a result. And that's still the area that then, it means in some respects they did the speech, but didn't really solve all of the questions, didn't answer all of the questions that were coming forward, because the big question has been, what are you going to do? Are we going to be paying any more money? And of course, then it was, we're going to have a budget in October. So effectively, shut up, don't ask me any more questions until October. That's when I'll answer them. So a smart move in some respects, because it means you don't make any more policy on the hoof. You say the date is set. That's when you'll get your answers. The problem is you're setting up October the 30th to be a very big day to be able to give you an awful lot of answers. And actually, we're looking at quite a busy period news-wise for the end of October. I wouldn't book any holidays. You're going to have the budget. You're going to have a Tory leadership announcement, and you're going to have the US election. So there's some pretty big stuff coming in the autumn.
Yeah, definitely. Before we touch upon both of those, the US election and the Tory leadership, I wanted to get your thoughts on where would your priorities be come October if you were supporting and advising Rachel at this point in time? Because to me, it's more of a redistribution of wealth and a recapitalisation of the poor, because a lot of the undercurrents of the challenges that we face, to me, comes down to wealth inequality. But I'd love to get your take on that and ultimately where they're going to support and drive the narrative of growth from.
I think you're right in that there is a big issue about where money's being made and where the inequalities are. I do think health still remains one of the biggest areas to focus on, because we have so many people that are not in work, that could be in work and that would want to be in work. But if you're at home languishing on a waiting list somewhere, or if you're even not fortunate enough, and it's a terrible indictment of the state that we're in, that you're even fortunate if you've made it onto a waiting list, because there's still people that are struggling on a daily basis to get an appointment with their GP. And so if you can't even get assessed at a primary care level to find out what might be wrong with you and get into the queue, that's a pretty miserable existence. So for people that are struggling, and the narrative around the lack of appointments, the narrative around even now doctors on strike, if you're somebody, for example, who's struggling with their mental health, you can't go to work because you can't get out of bed on a daily basis because you are really suffering. What on earth is there out there for you? If you feel like even just making that first step to making the first phone call to saying there's a problem is often a real battle. It's something that can tear families apart while they're asking someone to go and get help, seek help, do something, rather than do something to themselves, which is then catastrophic for them and for the rest of their family. Like, it's a really big deal, and I feel really passionately about it. I think it's an area that we've really overlooked, and instead the sort of debate has at times gone into sort of work shy and all sorts of other labels that have been put on people, when actually we've got to acknowledge that the world has changed post-COVID. For a lot of people, things are really tough, and people's coping mechanisms, people's ability to navigate challenges, it's been really tough for some people for a long time. If you add into that financial woes and you add in that inequality picture, it can be pretty bleak. And I think not having a health service that works effectively, and in the health service and the care system as well, we've got tons of people that are carers, unpaid carers, people that are, you reach my age, and if you're in your late 40s and early 50s, people are often tearing themselves in two, where they've got children that are doing big exams or going into the workforce, and they've got elderly parents, and the system is creaking at both ends. And so it's pretty tough. And I think we need to be getting that health service working better. Having a healthier nation will help make more productive people, a better, happier workforce, and a happier society. People won't be as frustrated about things. If you can't even get through to your GP, it's seen as a basic right. The NHS, if you can't even access it at a basic level, on a local level, I think we've got some pretty big problems to solve.
And you touch upon happiness, but that's the crux of a lot of it. There was a report out not so long ago where it placed the UK second bottom on a happiness index. And that's, to me, it's really quite problematic to a lot of the challenges we face. I think obviously mental health's one thing, but I do believe that we are within an epidemic of isolation, whereby a lot of the challenges that we see today, people either feel left behind or they don't have access to certain services and support networks that they potentially previously used to and was available to them. I think, whatever we do as a government going forward, I would like to see more focus placed upon that challenge that you mentioned in respect to the bottom end of the scale and the latter end of the scale, and more supportive mechanisms placed there.
And support for those people that are then working in the middle, that are trying to balance everyone else around them. There's a group of people who they're spinning the most enormous amounts of plates. Just about managing was that term Theresa May coined. And it's not just financially just about managing, it's just about managing life, because it's complicated. You've got elderly relatives. I know people that still, an elderly relative will go out in their car and they can't pay for their parking because they don't know how to do it on their phone. And they'll get a call while they're at work saying, can you pay for my parking on so-and-so street because I can't do it? And it's like the world's moved on for some people, but they haven't been able to move with it. And they're isolated. They're one step removed from services. And my mum's disabled. I was on holiday recently and she needed to get some cream. And the doctors on the phone told her she had to go online and do it. She's got MS. She's 75. She can't do it. She's calling me on holiday in Greece to sort out the prescription request, which I'm then doing on my, and I'm like, why? I could do it, but why should I? She should be able to access the health service equally. She shouldn't be shoved off to some sort of electronic system. And it's things like that as well. We lurched really quickly during COVID and we haven't rebalanced that for people, which means that isolation is really extreme. And when people can't afford to buy a house or rent a house even down the road from their parents anymore, they've got to move somewhere else because it's too expensive. You don't have family support networks in the way you used to. You are actually often moving away, and then everything's done by telephone, which makes everyone feel more isolated.
Yeah, and we've discussed this on previous podcasts, but it's almost like there's so many different files that Labour have to go through right now to addressing some of these underlying problems that have been inherent to the UK system for quite a substantial amount of time, that it's going to take time. But the counter to that is, I don't think they're going to be afforded time. We're going to have to start seeing some relatively quick wins here within the next couple of months. Otherwise, you can already see it with Keir's holdings. They're dropping already, and he's only just come into office. I don't think that's right, but this is the realities of the environment that they're going to govern within. It's challenging, it's turbulent. Look at the US. It took some time for Biden to stand down, but with the US elections approaching, what are your viewpoints in respect to that landscape?
It's an ever-changing picture. They were cruising for the Democrats, looking like they were just losing support, even elected folks very quickly with the pull away from Biden, and even the blunt and quite ruthless, I think, and probably necessary calls for him to stand down. And then obviously Kamala's come in and she's hit the ground running for sure. And she looks like she's had an initial bounce, but the challenge is that sustainable through this process now leading up to the election. And where does it go? What is the direction of travel in terms of policy? There are big challenges to talk about on a global level. We just had the prisoner exchange, and Biden was clearly very personally involved in that. Apparently, he was involved in calls and then announced he was going to be stepping down as the candidate, but was firmly remaining as president, probably because he wanted to see some of this stuff through. But there are big challenges on the global stage. And there are all these other issues. You look at CrowdStrike and the fact that we suddenly lost all our systems, went down overnight because of an update a company did. And you go, we're actually pretty vulnerable. We're not even vulnerable just to bad actors in the world. We're vulnerable to just the way it all operates. And that's pretty scary. When I go back to my earlier point about the old couple that can't pay for their parking, you've got an NHS that needs reform, but a lot of that reform is talking about going online and using AI and other systems. What happens when it doesn't work? My mum's been waiting for an operation since the beginning of June, which was cancelled as she was on her way to theatre because there was a cyber attack on the firm that did the blood testing. And so they couldn't guarantee the blood that they would be giving during the surgery, and they had to cancel it. And so she's still waiting for that to be rescheduled, which is, that stuff just makes, doesn't, if you're a bit worried as well about having some of this stuff done, that's not going to fill you with confidence when you need something significant done in hospital. So I think the reality of governing is elections are a damn sight easier in a lot of ways because you can talk about a lot, you can promise a lot. And while you've got to say you've done your sums, ultimately, until you're in, that's when the scrutiny really starts. And that's when it gets tough. But with a big majority, you've got a lot of people to support you getting things through and doing it the way you want to do it. But you've also got to bring the public with you on what you're going to do. I think what we're seeing with the riots at the moment is that a lot of people feel left behind by the discussion that's been going on. They feel left behind in terms of policy direction. They don't feel they've had a government that's been speaking for them or doing things that are relevant for them. And that's partly where some of this stuff comes from. And when there's a void, sometimes not so very nice things fill that void. And there are tensions and also just people that just don't understand really the way things work or the way things should work that are also playing a part in this, as well as people that are perhaps have just got different views. And then you get this tension and these problems. And for a government, they had, I think it was only, we were literally just as the government was elected and you had Wes Streeting on the airwaves saying, please go to your GP. They're still working. They're just on paper and pens because of CrowdStrike. You had people stuck at airports, people in the wrong places and all of that. Within a few weeks, you've got a Met commissioner who comes out of a meeting with the Prime Minister and grabs a Sky microphone and throws it on the floor. And you go, hang on a minute, like we have got some big problems. And both of those things were not foreseen at all. They were not in the big list of things that the government were looking at.
It is very much broken Britain at this point in time. It's up to everybody, not just simply government, to rebuild. It's up to us all. And how we rebuild is the interesting thing. Obviously, we've had various different waves of manifestos and pledges and what we want to do. But speaking from your experience and speaking from what you feel this country needs, what would your pledges be?
I mentioned the health service, but I think one of the other things that this really plays into, to our point about having countries giving advisory notices to their citizens about travelling to the UK, we're supposed to be achieving massive growth in order to fund all the things that broken Britain needs. And I hate that phrase because one of the challenges that we have is that we need investment in the UK. We need businesses to look at the UK as a viable option. We've got great history. We've got great traditions. We've got beautiful locations. We've got fantastic people. We should be selling Britain on the world stage. It's depressing that during elections how talked down the country gets. And I think it's irresponsible of all politicians to do that. I think it's dangerous talk because in a couple of weeks' time, you're going, everyone come here now, we need you. But we've just been telling you all how rubbish it is while we've been taking pot shots at each other. So we have to be responsible in the discourse, not just about personal stuff, but about how we talk about our country. And so we're now facing this narrative where a year ago, there was a report that was talking about, Lord Harrington did this report about investment in the UK and what was needed. And he said there was a 50 billion gap that we could basically close if we backed winners more and if we were less risk averse as a country. And I guess Great British Energy to some extent is a bit of that from the government. But if we've just talked down the country and we're also throwing bins on fire through windows of Greggs in towns and cities across the country, why on earth is a big firm going to go, currently looking at these 3 countries to invest in, how on earth is the UK going to be top of that list? So actually, this is on the government's agenda and has to be high on the government's agenda to deal with, and deal with well, really quickly, for lots of reasons, not just about public safety, not just about what we do about immigration more generally, not what we do about safety of mosques or churches or whatever else, or safety of Greggs and our towns and cities. It's about the fact we want people to invest here. And they're making decisions every day. Some of them might have put off those decisions for a few weeks thinking, let's see how things land with the new government. But my God, when we're actually burning our own country, you're not going to encourage a big firm to come and invest in your town. The government has got to get a grip on this pretty quick in terms of what it's going to do. But remember, the early narrative from the government, one of the first things they talked about was how there weren't any prison places left. But yet they're saying now that people are going to feel the full force of the law for what they're doing in terms of public disorder. Where are you going to put them? Because you've just said you're going to let some of the bad people out early already because we haven't got any room. And there's still big queues of people waiting to go through the courts. So what happens with the next lot of people that you're adding to that list? You can't just keep adding to the list of people that are going to get punished. You've got to stop the things from happening in the first place, which means dealing with the narrative that's developing. It's got to happen fast, and it's got to happen properly, because you can't afford for this to happen again in 6 months or a year's time.
I did think the appointment of James Timson was quite good, though, because in respect to the expertise that he brings, for me, it was nice to see, this was the positive side of Labour government. It was nice to see people of competence being given opportunities to thrive in challenging environments and positions. And yeah, his outlook was intriguing, especially when he talked about the prison system. One of the things that he mentioned was the fact that a third of people in prisons today are potentially in prisons that don't necessarily need to be there due to the sentencing that they got, and also the opportunities to actually release on early measures.
A third of them should definitely be there. There's another third in the middle which probably shouldn't be there, but they need some other kind of state support. A lot of them have got massive mental health issues. They've been in prison, in and out of prison all their lives. And then there's another third, and there's a large proportion of women. Prison is a disaster for them, because they're just putting them back in the offending side.
And I think that's not a bad idea, especially when you look at the severity. To look at, for example, I think it was one of the Just Stop Oil people, or maybe a few that got given, was it a 5-year sentence or something?
Yeah.
But again, 5-year terms don't actually make sense. So I think that there is an opportunity to reflect there and see, are there opportunities to release people early on the basis of the severity of their crimes? I think there probably is. But then equally, yeah, like to face the full hand of the law, it's a double narrative in respect to you're saying we don't have the room and then you're saying that we do. It's just the messaging. It just needs to be a bit more clear and concise to what they're trying to achieve.
And it's partly about reform, right? What Timpson's done is really impressive, because it was a masterstroke of an appointment. He's well liked across the political spectrum. He's really well regarded. That business has done incredible stuff. And if anything, part of his work should be about getting other companies to do more of that. Part of his focus should be on that piece of work, but also what is happening in prison. Because what often happens is people go in for very short sentences and they come out as probably better criminals, gung-ho on going and doing something else than they went in, because they're radicalized in a sense, because they meet other criminals and they get schooled in stuff while they're in prison, but not the right stuff. And actually, when the school systems fail people and they've left at 16 without proper qualifications and that they can't get proper jobs, that's when often people turn to some of the crimes that will put them in there for those short sentences. So you've got this sort of constant problem that's ongoing, because you're not, again, solving the problem early enough. It's all about prevention. Most of what government should be doing is about preventing things from happening. You prevent people from getting sick in the first place. You prevent them from being unemployed, because you give them the skills that they need. You give them the opportunities they need. And so a lot of the stuff is around what you do early, whereas when you've gone to the extremes of throwing a burning bin through front window of a Greggs, you've got to look at what you're going to do with that person to try and bring them to a different way of thinking and to live their lives differently, than to think that's the answer. Because putting someone in prison for a few weeks or a few months or even a few years probably isn't going to turn them away from doing that again.
It comes down to the mindset at the end of the day. You look at situations like that, and not really going to name names of some of the key protagonists in this, because I think people know who they are anyways. But looking at the people in which the narratives are being brought to attention from, I think we have to really critique that and really critique motives and really critique the underlying meanings behind some of these things. Because I'll give you an example. I'm up in the Northeast, and one of the things that I see day in, day out is, again, people feeling left behind. Like the Northeast, there has been a very evident managed decline over the last 14 years. It's left an awful lot of people behind. There's a poverty of opportunity here, but it doesn't take away from what makes this region great, which is phenomenal people. It's got an awesome history of industrial heritage, and there is huge swathes of opportunity here if there was the investment to be made. And it's one region of many, really. I think when we are looking at why people are throwing things through Greg's windows and doing looting and bits and pieces, underlying a lot of that is how you break that stranglehold around the difficulties people face. But rather than just allow them to go further down that rabbit hole, drag them out and show them what other possibilities may there be if you surround yourself with better actors. I just think that we are often a reflection of who we surround ourselves with.
And if you think something, you can search hard enough and find someone else who'll back up what you're thinking. Like, you can find people out there. We've also had, and I live in Southeast London. I don't know what it's like to live in the Northwest, the Northeast. I don't know what it's like to have a hotel of asylum seekers around the corner from where I live. There have probably been for too long too many people from certain areas dominating the conversation. The engagement probably hasn't reached out into communities that it needs to have reached out far enough to. And maybe it's been more window dressing than really meaningful engagement, so people feel included. We had, in 2019, the government was elected on a narrative around levelling up. Did anything get levelled up? Did anyone feel that they were better off? Probably not. And so there are people hurting. There are communities that feel left behind. And I am not best placed to say what that is or what the solutions are. But there are plenty of voices in those areas that can. And I think one of the government's challenges is going to be to ensure that they actually reach out far enough into those communities, which does mean engaging with people that are the furthest extremes of the conversation. It's not about just picking the people in the middle and having a conversation with them. It's about going out and finding out, where are things being discussed? What is being discussed? What narratives can be interrupted? How can they be meaningfully interrupted? How can people be better educated? There's so many aspects to it. But I also know that a lot of what's gone on is based on narratives that people really strongly believe, really passionately believe. And this hasn't happened in a fortnight or a month. This has been growing over years. So this is a big thing to deal with. And I think the government needs to be prepared for the fact that it isn't going to happen quickly. But at the same time, you've got to interrupt it somehow. So the full force of the law stuff is about interrupting the spread and trying to take the heat out of the situation. But the longer term community cohesion picture is a massive issue. And I'm sure political narratives, political discourse around stopping the boats and people invading this country and all sorts of other things that have been said, you could probably go back over loads of debates in Parliament and you could pick off language that we'd all think, yeah, that's not helpful. And politicians themselves have probably not done anyone a favour in some of the ways that this has been discussed over time. The Tory party themselves have torn strips off each other, and the way that the conversation's gone with them has been appalling at times. So I think this isn't a short-term fix by any means, and I think that's where the government have got to really consider carefully what their steps are, what they do, and how they ensure that they do get to communities that haven't had a voice. And even the ones they wouldn't want to normally engage with. It's their country too. They deserve to have an opinion, whether you like them or not.
There was one narrative within Labour's election campaign that was we want to be a government of service.
I invite you all to join this government of service in the mission of national renewal.
And I think that service to the people, that to me is the essential narrative. We need to dig more into that. I was encouraged by, for example, devolution. I think that's so needed in respect to the spreading of power and opportunities, and allowing platforms and allowing engagement for people within different regions to come together and talk not simply about the challenges that they face, but what are the solutions available. And I think that needs to be more of a longer focused, because often you mentioned before about government is the whole prevention versus reaction, but If we want to truly see a government of service within this country, then we need to look, what does 15 years ahead, what does 20 years ahead look like? What do we want to be as a country and individual regions? And how do we want to grow together? If we don't do that type of exercise now, and we don't think strategically about how to better place Britain as more of a brighter future rather than broken Britain, then we are going to continually perpetuate the chaos and challenge that we see today. And I do think that a lot of it can be countered. For example, if you are going to speak directly to some of the people that are rioting at the moment, it's getting underneath that frustration and anger to try and dig out what is the true meaning behind why they are on the streets today, rather than just simply the anger and the rage and the frustration. What's specifically leading to that? And to me, I think a lot of investment needs to be placed within Worst First. We really need to try and find the areas that have been really detrimentally affected by the last number of years especially, and make sure that we invest directly into people in those places to make sure that we start, as I said earlier, that recapitalization of the poor, that leveling up, or true leveling up of people and prospects and opportunities, that needs to take place. But yeah, that only happens when government opens up its doors to discussions and also criticisms and critiques, because without that, you end up missing what is the true lighting opportunities that we do have ahead of us, which is a collective journey and a collective togetherness as a nation that brings people back together to about what we want to be as a values-based economy rather than simply a fractured one.
And it's a long-termist approach, right? When I worked with Boris Johnson in London, the campaign that we worked on, we had kids, they were like under 15, that were stabbing each other. Gang warfare like you wouldn't believe. London was dangerous. There were lots of places that were dangerous. We spoke to families that mum was working 2 jobs and she couldn't keep her teenage son indoors after school because she wasn't there. So son would go home after school, get changed, go back out, and he'd be in with a gang. And then the gang would get involved with another gang. There'd be some row. And the next thing, knives came out and people died, right? It was awful. And a lot of the work that we did was around talking to the youth groups, talking to the community groups, talking to the people that really knew their area. And that's where sort of devolution actually does come into its own. To your point earlier, that you have people that operate at that level that is so much closer to its community that they understand it better, because there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach necessarily. But the problem was, through Boris, I didn't work with Boris in City Hall, but it was the policy stuff that we set up before he got there. And it was the election, the campaign he won on was that he was going to engage those groups more. Funding got cut for loads of those groups. So loads of those groups that used to turn up and have a presence after school, they would fill a void between the hours of 4 and 9 or something. And it meant that kids had someone to talk to, or they had somewhere to go, rather than just hanging around on a street corner where they were then more vulnerable to whatever else was going on in the area. And the problem is, where we then lost that sort of support, those groups had harder and harder hurdles to jump through to get funding. And gradually over time in London, what's happened is that has just grown again like a weed that was cut at down near the root, but not quite finished off. That behaviour, now we have had some knife crime. It's not as bad as it was, but now, if anything, it's been replaced, probably because people haven't got any money, by theft and this grabbing, as people call it, or snatching, or these crimes where people just will grab your mobile phone or your watch while you're walking along the street, back a moped sort of stuff. But it's this sense, it's crimes that people don't feel that they're going to get caught for, or if they did, they wouldn't get punished heavily for. And we put this great support in, but we took it away again. And the problem is then, by not having it there, what you end up with is this void gets filled by something, as I said earlier. And so you end up then with those communities who felt they could finally trust some people in authority. They don't trust them again because they let them down. And particularly if you're somebody who, I don't know, your dad left when you were a baby and it's taken you some real time to trust somebody, you finally had someone you used to see on a weekly basis, and then they just disappear because the money goes, the bus doesn't show up anymore, and that confidence has gone. And we let people down as well by doing things and then pulling them away. And sometimes that's worse. Sometimes the giving some help and then pulling it is more dangerous than never giving the help in the first place, because people then feel even angrier than they might have started because they feel that they've been let down. And then they wonder, was it their fault? Why did it happen? Why can't they trust anyone again? And then those emotions are even stronger than they were at the start of the process. You need governments thinking long-term cycles and not just about election cycles.
Yeah.
They need to think longer than that.
I've said before that I think that for us to get on top of the solutions that we need for this country, it's a two-termed parliament, because there's so many things to do. I mentioned earlier about the manila files, but there are so many different elements to go to. But you hit the nail on the head in respect to trust. If you were to speak to people, I'd imagine 9 times out of 10 of rioters at the moment, you'll hear the same narratives over and over again about they're all the same, they've let us down, and which to a large degree is true. But then it's trying to think of ways to, as you say, it's not necessarily working solely with people that you agree with, but it's ultimately working with people that you may have different views and opinions, but you need to get on top of those views and opinions as well in order to make sure that their voices feel heard. Because when people don't feel heard, they get angry. And this is the crux of a lot of what we see today in riots and all over the UK. It comes down to the fact that there's a lot of anger there. That anger, I could argue, would go probably back to pre-Brexit and pre-2016 in the respect to people did at that time feel left behind, and that those 52% of people that voted to leave. I'd imagine now, if you've seen the statistics anyways, if it was to be rehashed and redone, there would be a vastly different result. But again, and any large-scale transformation, because that's what we really need in this country, a transformation is not simply reform, but what does the future look like, and how do we make sure that the UK is more prosperous and opportunistic going forward? It needs to make sure that we bring everybody on board rather than just a certain few. And that to me is going to be a challenge, because drawing into the Conservative leadership race, for example, and the narratives that we've seen today that have led to a lot of the challenges that we see playing out before us, the ones that are seemingly highest in the betting, for example, Kemi Badenoch is 2-1 to become the next Conservative leader. Priti Patel's 10-1, Mel Stride's 25-1, James Cleverly's 11-2, Tom Tugendhat is 4-1, and Robert Jenrick is 8-5. Who potentially will be, and who potentially would be best served, from your opinion, to provide a new leader of opposition?
I don't know the answer to that yet, because I don't think we've seen enough about what they're really standing for. And I think that's going to emerge. There's still some proper launches to be done by the candidates. So I don't quite know what all their platforms are. There are some really good people within that field, and I've got a lot of time for some of them personally. I know them. I've worked with them. I've got to know them over several years. I've seen different roles they've done. But there are also people that I think are a bit more extreme, and I think are part of the challenge around not why we've ended up where we've ended up, but I think there's been too many discussions about some issues and not enough discussion about others. I don't know why every candidate's being asked about their position on ECHR. I'd like to know what they're going to do for the health service, to my point earlier. We're letting certain issues dominate the debate, which is also feeding into the narrative that's coming then from the protesters, because if the biggest topic is always immigration, then you think immigration's to blame for everything. And it's not. The health service is not going wrong because of immigration. In fact, it benefits from some forms of immigration, because we wouldn't have anyone working in the bloody thing if it wasn't for some of the people that came to this country. The suggestion that the NHS is not falling over because of the number of illegal immigrants, for example, is falling over because of years of mismanagement, of confused priorities, of not enough investment in the right places. Loads, you could go through tons and tons of reasons why. The social care system being broken, which means A&E is tied up with loads of people that actually have got severe dementia and probably should be in a care home. There's tons and tons of reasons. But if you talk to some of the people that are protesting at the moment, they'll tell you that it's because of immigration. And I don't buy that is the reason. But yet, if you look at what's been happening with the Tory leadership debate, you'd think the biggest issue was immigration and nothing else. You'd think there was nothing else wrong with the country to talk about, because it's dominated by one subject. And I think, again, that's doing a disservice to potential business investment. I think it's doing a disservice to the British public. I think it's doing a massive disservice to the Tory party, who, quite frankly, the best leadership candidate, in my view, is the person that doesn't say a lot for a bit longer and actually does the work to figure out why they lost. Because the idea that a few days after a crushing defeat, you come out and say, the reason we lost is all these things. And you go, hang on a minute, you were pushing all those things. You were selling that stuff a week ago. And so you can't suddenly change a tune and say that's the reason you lost the election. Like, you've got to do the work. You've got to do the hard yards on what does the country need? What are the solutions? How am I going to pull together people that can actually find those and that can deliver them in the future? Because otherwise, all you're doing is you're just a talking shop. And I think if we've got a Labour government with a big majority, the best form of opposition is actually a united opposition, which they have not been for a very long time. And that's really why they lost the election more than anything. It's because they got themselves tied up in knots post-Brexit, but then also getting sidetracked by reform. And yet no one's paying attention to the fact that the Lib Dems won a load of seats. So you've got to diagnose the problem properly before you can figure out the solutions. I'm still not sure the Tories have diagnosed the problem about themselves, let alone the country. And I think that work has got to be done. That's the priority. So I would say put your money on the people that are doing the hard yards on that stuff rather than telling everyone what the solutions are early.
So about diagnosing the problem, what would your advice be to some of these candidates at the moment?
I think there's still more to do. I heard pollsters saying in the run-up to the election that the NHS was a much bigger issue for focus groups, and on a lot of their polling than was actually being reflected in the public debate, for example, because it is a universal service. It's an area that touches everybody. So it is worth spending the time talking about and fixing because it affects everybody. And I think that's been overlooked by a lot of politicians for some time. I actually think politicians are so lucky. They have got so much information available now, more information than you could ever possibly need or want. Like, we have got polling companies that sprung up all over the place. We've got focus group data that they could be using to look at what the real discussions were. We have got think tanks galore who publish reports for free that you can read. There is so much information out there and it's at their fingertips, right? It's relatively inexpensive for a team to actually really delve into all this and come up with sensible, practical solutions and actually come up with a decent narrative about where it went wrong. Years ago, you'd have waited months for the books to be written about where it went wrong. You'd have waited so long for the analysis. And yet there's stuff that's available now. So there's no excuse, really. They should be out there really meaningfully engaging. And as I say, working out where it went wrong. And quite frankly, even being honest enough and saying, we're going to follow Keir's lead. We're going to have 5 key topics. This is what I'm hanging my hat on. The rest of it we'll figure out. But these are going to be the big ones. These are the big ticket things we've got to deal with now for the future prosperity of the UK. And maybe that's where you start. Maybe you just start with answering how you'd oppose or scrutinise Keir's key missions and start there. Don't try and be all things to all people, but do something and do it properly.
Yeah, definitely. I want to see a little bit more of, you said it before, but an opposition that works in partnership, because we've had so many years of this us versus them narrative. And that to me was one of the biggest eroding factors of the Conservative Party, that they became so fractionalised in respect to their sub-factions that they were a party within a party within a party.
Some of them worked really well with opposition and did it really quietly. There were amazing people like Tracy Crouch who did great work around betting, gambling, and about trying to protect people from the fixed terminal stuff, did some incredible work. People like Sir David Amess that died, that did incredible work on key issues, worked on things like endometriosis, not the sexiest of subjects for a man in his senior years to have been focusing on. We've had really good work across the House on things like autism. We've had incredible work on menopause, like stuff that really affects people in their daily lives. There are examples all over the place of great work, but most of the media don't find it sexy, don't find it interesting enough. It doesn't get focused upon. But on the big issues, actually, I've seen people calling for a royal commission on the NHS. And I'm like, actually, yeah, there's some merit in that. I've seen the Lib Dems talking about having much more cross-party work on social care. Yeah, I think there's merit in that. There are definitely areas where bringing together people across the political spectrum to say, how do we solve these challenges? And to the appointment of Timpson, bringing somebody in from the outside and saying, you've got great expertise, bringing Jackie Smith back in for Labour as a peer to look at skills. There are really great people out there who, if asked, would be willing to serve. And I think we should remember that there's great expertise. We're a bloody great country. I find it so sad, all the sort of the negatives. We've got amazing people. There are pockets of genius. People like yourself who want to talk about the issues, want to explore stuff, like you want to make it better. Most people do. And we can get a bit dragged down by the headlines and feel like it's all a bit bleak. But I think it's about creating the forums where people can work together and they can do it safely and they can do it without having concerns about expressing an opinion that might not seem popular or colourful or going with the mood of their party. They should be able to do what's right for what the UK needs. And I suspect there's a new generation of politicians that have entered the House now who may well come with some of that spirit, because they've got a big Labour majority. The Labour Party's probably not going to pay attention to some of the newer entrants. They're probably going to be finding their way. And some of the Tories that got elected also haven't got a leadership that are paying much attention at the moment. So some of them might form their own alliances and start exploring areas that could be great solutions of the future.
I think it comes down to, again, back to mindset, even the mindset of politicians, as to the whole analogy of ambulance versus fences. This is a time to be building the fences. This is a time to be looking at the problems we face, rather than just consistently turning up with ambulances to fix the problems at hand.
I heard a great guy had rang into a radio show the other day, and he said in his community that he had made an effort to learn how to say hello in different languages because of different people. And there was a park or somewhere, or a local market, where like a Sri Lankan would sell something, some food, and someone else. And he did the same with his kids. And so he said that the kids all grew up playing together, of all different nationalities. And it's not like this is new to have people in our communities that are people we don't look like or sound like. It's been happening for decades. And he was saying that this very multicultural society had grown up around him. And it struck me that he said he'd learned to say hello in different languages. And I thought, gosh, sometimes it does just start with hello. It's as basic as, even when you walk down your own street, and particularly if you've got a dog, you tend to say hello to other people when you've got a dog. We're often with eyes down and we look away from people. And yet we used to, years ago, men used to doff their hats and the ladies would do the same, or they'd nod or whatever. But we often walk past people, we don't want to get eye contact with anyone. And it's like we've become so much more insular. And I think it's the same in politics, reaching across the divide, having a conversation, saying hello. You'd be amazed if you spent a day there, you'd be shocked at how many politicians of different political parties do get on. And it's a shame the public don't see that enough. But it's definitely something that I think that just starting the basics of reaching across the divide, whatever that divide might be, is the start of forming the foundations of the solutions that we need in the future, whether that's public and private sector, whether that's different faiths, whether that's different races, whether that's different communities in the country, whether it's people from one side of the road to the other. It's all doable, but we've all got to start somewhere.
Yeah, definitely. In the UK, we are multicultural. We have so many different experiences with religion, life, where we've come from. It's what makes us so rich. But it's utilising that as a central pillar to grow from, rather than to divide. And I think that a lot of that comes down to, this collective desire for partnerships and change. But when we want to galvanise people on a more positivistic movement forward, we have to show people the value of togetherness, show people the value of collaboration and partnerships, and show people what a brighter future looks like, and start building towards that step by step. And only when we start doing that as a collective nation, I truly believe we'll grow, not just in GDP, but also back to that premise of happiness before. The UK is at heart a great nation, but it's lost its way, I think, over the last course of a number of years. And it's up to us all, not just government, to rebuild.
And we should grab the nuggets when we get them. Look at the people in Southport that came out after what happened and were helping to rebuild the wall of the mosque, and were making tea for the journalists that were in town. These communities they're not terrible places. They're full of great people. There are other people that have been involved in these things, some of them not from their community at all. So we shouldn't be writing off places. We should be remembering what's good about places and what's good about people.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a great place to finish. But before we do, I'll just ask for one last question. What are your key thoughts and takeaways?
Oh, gosh. I think there's a great saying by Dolly Parton that if you want the rainbows, you have to put up with the rain. And I think there's just a bit too much rain at the moment. And I think we all have to work out how to find the rainbows. So I hope people will work out how to find the rainbows in this dreary, rainy sort of period that we're going through. But I think there's great stuff coming ahead. So play your part if you can.
Amazing. Thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you.